See quite a few people are still making their way through. So give it a couple more seconds and then we'll make a start. Okay, brilliant. Well, I think most people are in now. So welcome to the first ECF training session that we're looking to run as IUA. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the sessions we've run on SCAP over the past couple of years. So we're delighted to have Charlotte Warr, Managing Director of Sarnia Training Limited, here to run through ECF. Couple of housekeeping points. We are recording the session. If you want to refer back to it later or send it to colleagues, please to get this information out as widely as possible. There are some polls throughout the slides, so please do get involved. That'd be great, and hopefully keep things a bit interactive. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box, which should be either down the bottom or the top, depending on how you've got Zoom set up. We can either pick those up throughout the session if we can fit them in, or we'll come to them at the end. But please do put them in there if there's anything you want to know. So with that, I will pass over to Charlotte to get into the nuts and bolts of the session, and hand over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Joe. Good morning to everybody, or I always think the Australians deal with it better with good day, so it doesn't really matter where you are. As you can see from the title, this is an ECF refresher. And as with every session that I do, if you come out at the end of it going, well, I haven't actually learned anything new, but it's reinforced that I'm good with what I do know, that's absolutely fine. And if it means that you are using ECF correctly, then that's absolutely lovely. Equally, if you walk out at the end of the session having learned one or two little extra nuggets, then that's equally good as well. And as Joe said, you should have a Q&A function available. He's going to be monitoring it. I'll pause every so often. We'll also have time at the end, and it can all be anonymous. So throw those questions out there, because if you've got a question, then you can guarantee probably a lot of other people will benefit from the answer. So I have simple objectives for this session. I want everybody around the table, whoever you are, and I'm going to ask who you are in a minute, to be able to confidently use the different versions of ECF. And I'll explore what I mean by that statement in a minute. And then also, although the primary topic of today is the company market versions of ECF, it is important to actually compare and contrast here and there with the Lloyd's version as well. So this is my plan. To achieve those objectives, we're going to go back to the basics, talk about things that can't be done on the platforms, and then make sure that you're comfortable about how to do what you need to be doing. So I can see we have a lot of people around the table, but I have no idea who you are. So Justin, could we have our first polling question, please? So very simply, please just identify which type of stakeholder you are. Hopefully I've covered all the options. So vote now. And hopefully, as it isn't a difficult question, we'll give you a couple of minutes just to answer. And Justin, as soon as you're happy that we've got a reasonable number of answers, if you could then put up the results for me, please. Okay, brilliant. We've got a nice, healthy selection of stakeholders. Thanks very much, Justin. We can move on now. So let me just wake my technology up again, having done that. So let's go back to the basics and talk about what ECF is. And this is the first thing that we need to be really clear about. ECF is not a single piece of technology. It is not in and of itself a system. it is an ecosystem. That's probably the best way to describe it, where you've got a quite complex, multifaceted database called class. And I'll introduce you a bit more detail to class in a minute. And that's where the hard data about the claim is put. And of course, the primary filler up of that database is anybody wearing a broker hat. So that is our brokers, our fee collectors, our experts collecting their own fees. But then it is supplemented by the insurer's market repository, the filing cabinet. It's the same filing cabinet, of course, that the risk and policy documents live in. And effectively, the claims documents are really just going on a different shelf. And then, and this is really important, the technology elements of ECF are also supplemented, and it's really important, by business rules. And there are two sets of business rules. One that pertain to the Lloyd's version of ECF, and you will hear talking about the Lloyd's SP&P, or the System Processes and Procedures. And then also sitting behind that in our thinking needs to be the Lloyd's claims lead arrangements, i.e. who are the decision makers going to be. And then you've got the company market system processes and procedures, supplemented by the company market, the IUA claims handling guidelines. So the IUA claims handling guidelines have been around for a very, very long time, but Joe's been a busy bunny with people in the market, obviously, and they have just been updated, and a new version was published literally only a matter of weeks ago with various webinars, etc. So, Justin, could we have our next question, please? And be honest. Okay. Give you a few minutes to answer. Okay, Justin, let's see those results. Break the news to Joe. Okay, well, at least that gives us some visibility as to what's going on. And what's quite interesting, of course, with the answer of the was not even aware there were guidelines. If you look at a standard slip template under the basis of claims agreements and the bit about the claims agreement parties, it has and has done for many, many years referred to the IUA claims agreement guidelines, but absolutely the reality is that very few people have read them. Thank you very much, Justin. We'll move on now. So, it's good to have just a little bit of history because it sets everything else into context. The company market, long before potentially some of you were born, actually existed as two different camps, if you want to call them that. You had the marine and aviation companies, and their trade body was the Institute of London Underwriters, or the ILU. And then you had everybody else, and their trade body was LIRMA, London International Insurance and Reinsurance Market Association, I think, something like that. Anyway, back in the mid-80s, those two trade bodies, those two camps, as it were, developed separately and independently their own electronic claims platforms. Now, again, some of you around the table may have been around at that time. They developed them completely separately. The ILU one was called CLAMS, and the LIRMA one was called ELAS. So they were developed separately, independently, with completely different functionality that suited what was required in their market at the time. And the way it worked at that time was that the broker would put data into clams or ELAS, and they would send that out to underwriters, and underwriters could let them know whether they wanted them to tot around with the paper file to supplement that electronic presentation. So the only thing that's really changed for the company market on both sides is the fact that instead of the broker having to tot around with a paper file, there is now the insurer's market repository, the electronic filing cabinet. So that's where the file is put. And the reality is that the functionality actually in both versions of the company market ECF is much broader in terms of what can be done. Some of it is technology driven and some of it is business rule driven. And when it's only business rule driven, it's important to understand that the technology is not necessarily completely locked down. And so you have to understand the business rules. So, for example, and we've got brokers sitting around the table, we've also got multi-platform carriers sitting around the table, so company and Lloyd's. In the company market, if you've got a claim that's so early in the policy period that the risk itself has not yet finished being processed by Velanetics, you haven't got signing numbers, you can present that claim on either of the company versions of ECF. That's absolutely fine. From the broker's perspective, the additional aggro is you've got to physically enter all of the market details rather than them being drawn down electronically because they're linked to the signing number. On the Lloyd's side, it is not permitted in the business rules to do unsigned entries. And therefore, if you haven't yet got your signings from Velanetic on the Lloyd's side, then you're going to have to start the claim off on email, or you could use good old-fashioned paper, I suppose. And then, as and when you have got the signings, backload. The same with the partial markets. So, for example, I don't know, let's say you've got a reinsurance contract. You've got a reinsurance contract where there's 5 companies on it. Maybe 2 have commuted. So 2 have cashed out of the deal. They're not involved in anything anymore. They've kind of paid their money and run. But there's 3 reinsurers still involved. That's fine. You know, the ability to manually manipulate the market on the company side, absolutely. That cannot be done per the business rules on the Lloyd's side, and so you have to do it on email, and Velanetic will just deal with it in the background. So, with that in mind, my third and last polling question, just to get a sense of what you guys are using. Please, Justin. So, there are 3 versions of ECF. The ILU version, the Lerma version, and the Lloyd's version. Just interested to know in terms of my population sitting around the table, nearly 200 of you, which versions you're using. Hopefully you know. Okay, well, hopefully on the basis that everybody should know what they're using, let's have a look at the results, please, Justin. Okay, so a mixed bag, and that's absolutely fine. As I said, we're going to be talking in detail about how they all work, and although we're company market as our central focus, we are going to refer to Lloyd's as well. That's brilliant. Thanks a lot, Justin. So let's look at a schematic. And as I've said, ECF is an ecosystem. Okay, it's made up of a number of constituent parts. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to is actually the bottom left-hand corner, where we've got what we call the class database. Now, do you remember I said that when the ILU set up their version of electronic claims, it was called CLAMS? And when Lerma set up their version of electronic claims, it was called ELAS. Well, it doesn't take a genius to work out that class is a combination of those 2 names. And if we think about, again, the history, the IUA only came into existence in 1999, which I appreciate for some of you is possibly a lifetime ago. But that was a merging of those two trade bodies. The trade bodies might have merged. The names of the technology might have been brought together, but the databases have not actually been completely merged. So what we have with the class database, and I apologize if we have any data scientists sitting around the table, is we have effectively a single database, but it is heavily segmented. So I like to think of it as a house with 4 rooms in it. Each room has a door to the outside through which data can come in and data can go out. But the walls in the house are almost impenetrable. So data cannot easily flow through the rooms in the house. And so for anybody that's sitting around the table who is a broker, so whether that's a broker, a fee collector, an expert collecting their own fees, the first thing they have to do is go, which insurers in London do we need to communicate with? Which of the 3 versions of ECF out there do we need to use? And effectively, worst case scenario, if one wants to put it that way, is that anybody filling the broker role says, right, well, we've got some Lloyd's people, we've got some ILU companies, and we've got some Lerma companies. And so what you can see there is 3 rooms in the house into which our brokers need to put data. And so in that first box, you can see in the sort of description of ECF where it just says class, if a broker has both ILU companies, Lerma companies, and Lloyd's, they need to effectively put data down, well, not effectively, actually, put data down 3 separate pipelines to fill those 3 separate rooms in the house. And in terms of the data that is required in each of those rooms in the house, there is some differences between them. I mean, not the obvious ones, of course, like the signings are going to be different and who the bureau leader is going to be different. But there can be also sort of subsets of differences between them. So that's the first job. Hard data into whatever combination of the 3 data rooms in the house is required, supplemented, at least only once, so that's a good thing, by documents. And as I said before, the insurer's market repository, market filing cabinet, hopefully our brokers' colleagues have already uploaded risk data, policies, endorsements, risk bordereau, whatever's required as part of their work. So all we're focused on is putting on claims related documents. And now we need to come back to those business rules again around what is a legitimate presentation. And certainly on the Lloyd side, a legitimate presentation requires both data and documents, whereas I don't think it does on the company side. So, broker has done their job. And what they're going to do is they're going to release that transaction basically into cyberspace. And one of the key pieces of data that the broker will have put into that class database, whichever one, ILU, Lerma, Lloyd, is who is the bureau leader. And that is going to dictate what the technology does in terms of where it sends the data first. Now, there's something called claims workflow triggers. Now, the claims workflow triggers basically are the triggers for effectively the release of the data packets. So the information coming out of the ECF ecosystem in the direction of the leaders to populate their workflow systems. Now, there are 2 types of brokers. There are batch brokers and there are online brokers, and you can be a batch broker and still be able to do things online. But what's the difference between the 2? Well, an online broker is one where usually humans are going to have to log into class and enter claims either as a new claim or an updated transaction individually. A batch broker is one where basically their systems are hardwired into class and into the IMR. So it's not a case of individuals going in, but there is output from the broker's systems. If necessary, individuals can go in afterwards and modify things, of course. And so the insurers will have identified to Velenetic how often do we want these claims workflow trigger updates to be sent to us? Basically, how often do we want our workflow to be refreshed? And that might be every hour, might be every 6 minutes, whatever discipline they've asked for. And so if a broker has identified Swiss Re as the Lerma Bureau leader, then it will appear in their to-do list. Now, a lot of carriers, of course, now are using what are called write-back systems, and their to-do lists will be absorbed into those write-back systems. And the whole point of a write-back system basically is to allow an insurer to basically do everything to do with that claim in one place. And when I talk about everything to do with that claim, what I mean is to review the ECF presentation and to respond to that ECF presentation, as well as capture any internal notes, any internal additional coding, whatever might need to be done, but all in one place. And when we're talking about write back, what we're talking about is that technology. So you'll hear people, and some of you may use things like Dockersoft or Trax or Guidewire. Your entry as an insurer in the response fields in that system will be writing back, literally, down the wire into the class database. I won't be showing you screenshots of any write back systems. I'll be showing you screenshots of what I would call ordinary ECF. And of course, for those of you that are brokers, this might be a view that is a surprise to you. Because actually, in reality, although you as the brokers are putting information into the class database, what the insurers are looking at is a user interface which is actually via the IMR. It's a different view and has different things presented to them than what you see, but I'll explain what I mean in a minute. So that claim has ended up in the leader's to-do list. Now here, up until now, the process has been the same, whether it be Lerma or ILU. The only difference is that the data would have gone into a different room in the house. At the point of arriving with a leader, that's where the processes diverge, because what a leader has to do at that point and the power of that leader differs depending on whether it's ILU or Lerma. And so the first kind of baseline difference is that a Lerma leader has no decision-making authority, with one exception that I will talk about, but broadly no decision-making authority on behalf of any other Lerma insurers. They still have a role as a leader, but that's more of a data guardian that I'll talk about. Whereas if you're an ILU leader, absolutely, you have quite a lot of authority on behalf of your following market. And in fact, in some ways, it's very akin to the Lloyd side. So, of course, that's important if you're the broker to be mindful of, well, okay, how many decision makers am I expecting to see responses from for whatever transaction I'm sending to whatever market? So in the Lerma market, if there are 10 Lerma insurers, then once the leader's done what they need to do, and I'll talk about that in a minute, then it will go to all of the others for them to look at. Whereas in the ILU market, not necessarily the case. I will go into more detail about that, I promise. The last thing I just want to talk about at this point is a really, really important difference with the Lloyd's version of ECF. On the company side, Lerma or ILU, when you respond, it has a really positive impact. Stuff happens. And it's particularly important when we're thinking about money movement. If the broker has submitted a settlement transaction and either on the Lerma or the ILU side, the insurers go, yeah, happy to pay. Cogs start to move in the banking system. And I'll talk about the timing of the cogs moving in a minute. That is absolutely 180 degrees the opposite from the Lloyd's version of ECF. The Lloyd's version of ECF, if the broker submitted a settlement transaction and the decision makers, whoever they might be, it might be just the leader, might be two decision makers, if they go, yeah, happy to pay, nothing will happen at that point. Because on the Lloyd's side, the magic happens involving the fourth room in that house. Okay? Where what has to happen on the Lloyd's side is that the data that the broker has put in the class at Lloyd's room in the house has to be transferred by the people at Velenetic into the XCS class room in the house. And it is the release of transactions from that room in the house, so that extra step being done, that means that the overnight messages come out to Lloyd's followers and money starts moving out of bank accounts. Whereas on the company side, it is responses in ECF by the leaders and agreement parties that will have an impact on data flows and also on money movement. Okay. In both the Lloyd's and the company side, you will see that one of the data flows at the end of the process is back to the broker. And of course, this is really important where there is money movement, because the way that central settlement works is that every broker will have a single net settlement every day from every insurer. And so therefore, whilst there might be a big number that's gone in one direction or another between any one of you and a broker, or if you're a broker, you and any insurer, of course, you need to pick the bones out of that to be able to see, well, what's included in that in terms of claims payments or premium refunds or whatever it might be. And so that's why within all of ECF, it's so important to have really accurate claims references, for example, so you can see what's going on. So any questions popping up so far, Joe, that we need to address?
Nothing at the moment. So I think we can keep going. And if anyone does have anything throughout, then I'm keeping an eye on those and we can pick them up at the end.
Alrighty, thank you. So just to be clear, if you're not sure about, particularly on the company side, am I dealing with an ILU company? Am I dealing with a Lerma company? Look at their underwriting stamps. And of course, you can look at it in terms of a PPL or white space stamp as well. If you look at the company code, you can see there 6 numbers divided up 4 to 1. Sometimes it might appear, 7 numbers. Now that tells you it's an ILU company. Okay. Now, again, as part of the history, although the company market developed in the 2 wings, electronic claims handling in the late 80s, the Lloyd's market was very much, oh, no, we can't possibly be dealing with that. And so it didn't come to pass for Lloyd's, of course, until a lot later. But when the Lloyd's version was being built, it was very much templated on the ILU version. So there are some differences, but it's going to look a lot more familiar to you. In terms of a Lerma company, again, look at the company stamp. It's got a letter and 4 numbers. Now, please do not fall into the trap of going, oh, well, ILU companies, surely they're only going to be handling marine and aviation stuff. That could not be further from the truth. And I'll talk about why that matters in a minute. You can have a company that was set up as an ILU company. But now, and because maybe, when it was set up, it was going to be writing marine business. So that was its natural, like, home, as it were. But now it's writing a broad form book. I strongly suspect, although I don't know definitively, Joe might, is that any new companies being set up today, I think would always, irrespective of their book of business, be set up as a Lerma company. Okay. So,
Yeah, I'm not. Well, I think you have the option to be set up as to use
oh, right. Okay.
either bureau. So, but I mean, yeah, to your point, it no longer follows the historical norms for why
No,
you would sign up for either one.
no,
I mean,
no.
as you were saying earlier, with the different rules, it's sort of you can have both. Many companies do, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Aspen, and I mean, I don't know if we've got any friends from Aspen sitting around the table, but Aspen is a good example. They've got more than one company. They sit in both sides, as I think do Markel as well, if we've got any Markel friends sitting around the table. So you might think that in the company market, there's very little in the sort of concept of a leader, but actually there is quite a healthy concept of a leader. Again, slightly different in some ways, particularly on the Lerma side to the Lloyd side. The role that is common across all three markets is that of a data guardian. Now, those of you certainly on the broking side who use class, you will know that there are very few fields that are mandatory. You've got to put something in there. And there's very little in the way of kind of cross validation within the system to sort of check whether something you put in one field makes sense compared to another field. And so it's very much the role of the leader to check that transaction coming through, but it works in a slightly different way because on the Lerma side, you have this scenario where the transaction goes to them first and nobody else can see it at that point. The followers effectively are blind. And so a Lerma leader has to circulate that transaction. And the circulation activity is effectively opening the gate and saying this transaction is it's probably not going to have all the information you want, particularly at first notice, but the information that's in here is accurate. For example, date of loss is accurate, name of the insured is accurate, etc. Therefore, I am prepared to release this data and the transaction itself to my followers to then go and do stuff with it. And why that role is really important as a Lerma leader is that before you circulate, if you spot there's something wrong with that data, the broker can correct it. After it has been circulated, that data is locked. And so the resolution of any issues has to take a different pathway. On the ILU side, there's no concept of circulation at all, but there's still very much this idea of data guardianship, but there is no concept of that data being locked. Again, that works very much in the same way as the Lloyd's version does. That same transaction, if it's queried, and we'll talk about what the query terminology is in both markets in a minute, that can be amended by the broker. So very, very important distinction there. ILU, you can amend the data in a transaction and re-release. Lerma, you can as long as it's not been circulated. Once it's been circulated, you can't. But the biggest difference between the Lerma side and the ILU side is that, with one exception, as I said, that we'll talk about in a minute, there is no delegation of decision making to a Lerma leader. It's every carrier makes their own decision, whether that be advices or settlements. On the ILU side, effectively the opposite. The advices are leader only, and settlements can actually be leader only as well, or in certain circumstances, and go and read those IUA claims agreement guidelines, where a second can be involved as well. But then there's also the opportunity for an ILU follower to object to a decision that's been made. But, and you'll see when you look at the guidelines, you've got to be quick on the draw. to make sure that you object in an appropriate period of time. So one of the things that is common across all three versions of ECF, if you're in ECF itself rather than necessarily using a write-back system as an insurer, is there a whole load of hyperlinks. So I think it's important just to talk about how they work. The first one is the document file viewer. Now, remember, the broker has uploaded documents into the IMR, but the insurer's view of ECF, and you'll hear people talking about ECF2 as an unimaginative contrast to the previous version, which is ECF1. ECF2 does not show the insurers the documents in their native form. What it has built into it is basically a piece of Adobe functionality, which is going to try and stitch those documents together. And you can choose various combinations of the documents on this transaction or previous 4 transactions, or you can have the risk documents as a separate book and present them to you. Conceptually, fabulous. If all of the documents that are being presented are, for example, already PDFs, works really nicely. Does not work with things like spreadsheets, things like Excel spreadsheets, because effectively it works a bit like a print preview function. And so you will get a fairly simple spreadsheet spread across 1 trillion pages, which is going to be painful. Now also, and this is a plea to the brokers particularly, when you load up documents into the IMR, particularly loading up emails, a lot of you, both brokers and insurers, possibly even our friends at the IUA, will have as part of their email footers icons. So it might be a Twitter icon, it might be a LinkedIn icon, it might be a Grace Church award icon, it might be Pride Month. It doesn't really matter what the icon is. But what the IMR will do when you load up that email is it will strip out each of those icons and load them up separately, which means that when the insurers are looking at a document through document file viewer, what could be a 2-page email with, say, 5 icons involved ends up being a 7-page email because each icon has a separate page. You multiply that by multi-chain emails, you can see how painful this is going to get. So just watch out for that. Maybe it's not something that you've observed before, but you can untick those icons as part of the document load up to get rid of them. So view UMR, that takes the viewer, the reader, basically upstairs into the policy section of the insurer's market repository, and it will allow you to look as an insurer at the risk documents in their native form. It will also allow you to look at the signings. So if you're concerned that maybe the broker has used the wrong signing number and date, and this would be applicable on any of the 3 platforms, you can go and check the applicable signings. Cross-market comments is the most useful thing that you can be looking at, and brokers, you can look at it as well. Now, this has some dependencies. In order to make the walls in the house, remember I said that the walls in the class house were almost impenetrable, the same UCR must be used across all bureaus. And I see sometimes that that's not the case. I also see sometimes that transaction references are slightly different as well. And that makes the walls impenetrable and makes it very, very difficult to see what's going on. But certainly as somebody who's spent a long time doing claims, whether it's a claim that I've seen myself recently or it's a claim that I haven't seen for a while that I'm picking up and somebody else has seen before, this is a great place to go and see what's going on. And of course, if I'm a bureau lead, so I'm leading the ILU bureau, for example, but the overall lead is in one of the other sectors of the market, it allows me to go and see whether they've responded yet and what they've said. Now, if you click the IMR hyperlink, it takes you behind the scenes, I suppose you could say. So unlike the view UMR, which takes you, as I call it, upstairs into the policy, IMR takes you behind the scenes into effectively what is ECF1, or you'll hear people talking about the native IMR. So you'll still be in the same claim, but you will now be able to see the documents that have been attached, and this is particularly important for the insurers, in their native form. And so particularly if you know there are Excel spreadsheets involved, then don't even try the DFE, just go behind the scenes. Obviously, if you're using a write-back system as an insurer, one of the benefits is that the documents should all get sucked down into your system in their native form, and you can then go and have a look at them there. Claims awaiting action, of course, is super helpful if you're an insurer that doesn't have a write-back system, because this will just show the totality of what's in the organisation's to-do list, and you can filter it by company or Lloyd's, if you're both, type of business, advices, settlements, etc., etc. Send link is quite handy because what it does literally is it fires up your email system and puts in the body of the email a hyperlink to the particular transaction on a particular claim. And so let's say you wanted to communicate with somebody else. So that might be you want to communicate maybe with your boss. Again, if you haven't got a write back system, you don't have a sort of an internal referral system, then you can send your boss an email, which, as long as they've got an ECF login and they are logged in, you click on a hyperlink and it just takes them straight where they need to be. And the same is going to be true, for example, for those of you on the Lloyd side, if you want to communicate with followers. Now, view market response is quite useful because it tells you where the transaction is in the cycle. So, for example, if as a broker, you can see, well, you've got 10 Lerma insurers on it, and only 5 seem to have responded yet. You might want to get the help of the Lerma leader to just try and see what's going on. As the broker, you'll be able to see in the class database who hasn't responded. But this is how the Lerma leader would be able to go in and say, right, okay, Fred, Bert, Harriet, they've all responded, right, I need to give, Georgia and Emily a bit of a prod. And then last but not least, the view UCR transactions is exactly what it says on the tin. It brings you up a list of the UCR transactions, oldest at the bottom, newest at the top. It will give you 100% numbers, and it's a useful functionality if you want to move around in the file. So if you want to actually go back and see something earlier, then it's very useful, particularly if you then want to have a look at the documents that were in the file at that point. Because if you've got a large claim and you do use the DFE and you ask it to produce the whole claim file, then I'm sure you've all seen the ECF whirly wheel of doom. Okay, so don't ask it to produce a huge, great file. If you know that you're looking for documents from earlier, just navigate your way back earlier in the file and then look for documents from that point. Okay. So this is a screenshot of the basic response screen on the ILU version of ECF. And the Lerma one is much the same in terms of how it's structured. Everything on the left-hand side, and it will differ slightly between Lerma and ILU because it will depend on the different data that the broker is putting in. Left-hand side is data that the broker has put in and can't be tweaked by insurers. Okay. Right-hand side is the response screen, and you can see right at the top those hyperlinks that we've just talked about. So let's look a little closer at the bottom of the ILU response screen. So on the ILU side, it doesn't matter whether it's advices or settlements. The two choices that insurers have are positive, which is authorised, or effectively query, which is penned. Okay, simple. Those are the two responses. Now, in the business class, the ILU version of ECF is set up with marine business classes, which means that if you are using an ILU company as an insurer to write non-marine casualty business, then you're going to have to spoof this field because it is mandatory. Just spoof it to the best of your abilities. Okay. Now, in both the company versions of ECF, that simultaneous reinstatement toggle is really important because it does have a system impact. Do you remember I said that on the company side, either version, if you agree to pay money, cogs will start to move automatically. But obviously, the whole concept of a simultaneous reinstatement of premium is that reinstatement is premium is paid at the same time as the claim. That's the gig. But that reinstatement premium is going to have to be processed by a human at Valenetic. So the brokers should have loaded up the reinstatement premium documentation, and you will look at it as the claims person. And let's say you're doing excess of loss reinsurance. You will approve it. Your agreement, your approval of the claim is taken under the business rules on all three platforms to be agreement to the reinstatement premium. But you need to move that toggle, which its default is no, move it to yes. And what that does is it puts a lock on the claim movement, the cogs moving on the banking side. And that lock will stay in place until the human at Valenetic processes the related premium. They then release the lock so that the premium and claims move simultaneously. Okay. Now, you'll see there the references to chase ups. Now, remember, this is 40-year-old technology we're looking at. This is to allow you, if you want to manage your own static process in the background. And so you could set it to yes and put a chase up interval of, say, 9 months, if that's your house discipline. And then, as an insurer, somebody somewhere in your organization should have a class administrator login. They can log into the back of class, not ECF, class, to then pull out reports. Okay. Now, remember, some of you are, I think in your results, you said you were Lerma only. Some of you said you were Lerma and ILU. Some of you all three. Remember that the Lerma functionality, still a company, the functionality and the business rules are different, all right? So, circulation. I make no bones about repeating the importance of this. It's a really, really important role as a gatekeeper. Don't just as a leader go, right, okay, open the gate, it's going to be circulated. Because basically, if that data is not fit for purpose, as I said, it might not be complete, particularly at first notice of loss. But if there's something wrong about that data, as soon as it's been circulated, it's now populated everybody else's systems and yours. And that data is locked. So that transaction cannot be amended by the broker. And so the resolution to that incorrect data after circulation is a different process. If, as a leader, you spot it before you circulate it, then contact the broker. Hopefully there's contact details on the ECF transaction, email, phone, whatever the appropriate thing is. If you can't get in contact, then of course at the point of circulation, your two options are circulate or reject. So here's the Lerma circulation screen. And again, you will see some business classes. So equally, if you happen to be writing marine-ish business using a Lerma company, you may again have to spoof the business classes slightly. Now, the business class, the claim category, the subcategory are set at first device, mandatory at first device, and then they should stay. They should remain set for future transactions. You can see the same thing about the reinstatement. And again, the importance of, if there is a reinstatement premium, moving that toggle across to yes. Now, for those of you who do have the Lloyd's exposure as well, same toggle, different impact. Because, of course, remember what I said that there will be humans at Velenetic who will be looking at the claims data, doing something with the claims data. And so that toggle is not so much a system lock as a prompt to your claims colleagues at Velenetic that they need to process the premium at the same time. So all underwriters to see the file, well, of course, they can all see the file because it's in the IMR already. But there are some of these radio buttons which will trigger automated responses for followers. Okay. So if it's set as if you move that toggle as the leader on minor precautionary to yes, and the incurred is 0, then it automatically sets followers' responses to agreed. Okay, when it comes to the sort of formal responses. You can see the same point about the static chase up. Now you see there about the contractual condition applies. Well, it is possible, rare, but possible, that you could have an entirely Lerma market where the market has agreed leader only. In that situation, rare, but it could happen, that toggle could be moved to yes. And in that situation, if you're the leader, your response will be reflected down everybody else. Now, we're going to be talking about SCAP in a minute. Be mindful, you should not change this toggle even for SCAP. Even if you are a Lerma leader and you are the SCAP leader, leave that toggle alone because otherwise it completely messes up the robotics of Velenetic. If you set cedant in liquidation, of course, that would only be applicable for reinsurance business, to yes, then that sets everybody's response to FIL, which, remember, this is 40-year-old technology, was the response that would be used to ask the broker to bring the paper file around. So it's a kind of a bit of a daft response because, of course, the file is in the IMR. So here you can see the two options. Is it good to go? Can I release this transaction to the rest of my followers as a Lerma leader? Or do I need the broker to correct some bits and bobs? So I'm going to need to reject it. So, as I said, 40-year-old technology. So some of the responses, particularly after circulation, are completely out of date. Just ignore them. But particularly where there is a request from the broker for money movement, there are two ways of agreeing to move money that have very different impacts on the speed with which that money moves. Okay, this is only on the Lerma side. And then with querying, again, it works in a slightly different way, and also the resolution of the query works in a slightly different way. So let's have a look at a Lerma response screen, and I just particularly want to look at the bit at the bottom. So this is an advice screen. So as a leader, after you've circulated, you've still got to intellectually respond to the claim. And as a follower, this is the only thing you need to do. And you can see there are a number of responses. CAA, claim advice agreed. DIS, basically no, it stands for dispute. INF, more information, please. That's basically the Lerma version of query, or the query in Lloyd's or penned in ILU. And FIL you don't need, because hopefully the file is in the IMR. If this was a settlement request, the options would be yes instead of CAA, no instead of DIS, and there would also be an option of ACC. Now, ACC stands for accounting, and it's going to be most often used, I think, with reinsurance, where basically if a claim has come in where I'm reinsuring Joe, that I might agree technically that the claim is recoverable, that I do owe Joe money, but it may be that he also owes me money. And so what the ACC does is it tells the broker that the claim is technically agreed, but there'll be no signings issued on the back of it because there needs to be some discussion in the background as to how any set-offs are going to occur. So, money movement, particularly on the Lerma side, okay? But it also relates to the ILU side as well. If everybody that needs to, remember there might only be one on the ILU side, says yes, then there will be a signing generated on the evening of the last response. Okay? Now, the signing being generated and money actually moving depends on the settlement cycle. So, most insurers effectively now 3-day settlement. Now, on the Lerma side, if somebody says no, so 10 Lerma carriers, 9 say yes, 1 says no, blocks everything. Okay, so as a broker, you've got to be really constantly watching out for that. If you've got your 10 Lerma carriers, 5 of them say yes, and the other 5 just haven't quite got round to it yet, they haven't said no, they just haven't said anything at all, then the signing for the yeses, so effectively a partial settlement, will happen the 5th day, the evening of the 5th day after circulation. But, and this is particularly relevant in Lerma, there is the ability to dislocate payments. And what I mean by that is on the Lerma response screen, if it's a settlement, you've still got the same options of yes, no, etc. But there's a radio button a bit further up that says immediate part collection. Default is no, but it's moved to yes. For that carrier, it dislocates their payment from everybody else's. And to the brokers around the room, their response will appear as a CES when you're reading it through class, okay, rather than yes. Now, for those of you that are insurers, Lerma insurers, you might say, well, oh, that sounds like quite a good thing to do. Yeah, maybe we want to stand out from our peers and all of those things. So if you're not already aware of whatever your house rules are, find out. And what I would say, just as a word of caution, is if you are a Lerma follower and you're going, well, everybody else has been really slow, we're going to say yes and dislocate. Particularly if the Lerma leader has not yet intellectually responded, you might want to just check and wait and see what their response is. Now, querying. This is where I see the heffalump traps appearing probably more than anything else, okay? The ILU and the Lloyd's functionality are effectively the same. So the carrier queries, so in ILU, you use the pend option. On the Lloyd side, you would use query. And if that query is about something to do with data, let's say the data loss is wrong, then on the ILU side, the broker can correct that transaction, that data is still open effectively. The broker can correct that transaction and re-release it. That's lovely, okay? And the key thing is that until that transaction is resolved on the ILU and the Lloyd side, if it's in query or pending state, it's blocking the pipe, okay? Completely the opposite on the Lerma side. So the functionality is going to be the inf button. But the key thing is that if that transaction has been circulated, which it will have been by this point, then that data is locked. The broker cannot, with the best will in the world, amend that data in that transaction. So the resolution is going to be one of two things, okay? It is appropriate in certain circumstances to delete the transaction and start again. Now, be very clear that any comments that have been applied by any market to a transaction that is then deleted, they will still be in the database. So the transaction will not be visible in terms of seeing what's in the transaction. But if one looks at cross-market comments, for example, we will be able to see them, okay? But on the Lerma side, let's say, again, that query was about the fact that the date of loss was wrong. The resolution will more often than not just simply be to load an amended correct transaction on top. Now, an INF transaction on the Lerma side does not block the pipeline, okay? And so what you could do as insurers is just deal, hopefully positively, with the corrected transaction and leave the INF'd one kind of hanging in the ether. That's not very tidy. It's not best practice. It's not good housekeeping. Ideally, what you should be doing is dealing with that INF'd transaction as well and changing it now to a positively accepted transaction because it's been dealt with. But be really, really careful about the order in which you deal with things, because it might be quite natural to go in and deal with the latest transaction. Yes, it's all lovely and correct. Respond, la, 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 go back, go into the INF transaction again, change the response, la, 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 la. If you do that, the data that will be feeding into your systems as insurers will be the data from the incorrect transaction, because it'll feed in the order that you respond to things. So if you're going to be tidy, and I would urge you to be tidy, go and deal with the INF transaction first, having satisfied yourself that the new one answers the question, okay? And I do see a lot situations where there are queries on the Lloyd side or queries on the ILU side where the broker has tried to answer the query by loading in a new transaction. And it might be because, you've got more Lerma experience and, without knowing it definitively, why would you think that the functionality would be different? So last but not least, I just want to talk about SCAP, okay? So if you remember, the concept of SCAP is that if a claim is small enough and nothing too messy in terms of its facts, there will be potentially one single intellectual decision maker, so the SCAP leader. And that might be a Lloyd syndicate, it might be an ILU company, it might be a Lerma company, or it might be a company that does not belong to one of those trade bodies, or more importantly, does not use company ECF. And the most obvious example of that is Lloyd's insurance company. So the reality of SCAP, and if any of you have sat around in our SCAP sessions, you'll know this, is that it is theoretically a brilliant wheeze. It is not in any way, shape or form supported by the technology. So every stakeholder, broker, insurer, needs to be really clear about what they should be doing and, more importantly, what they shouldn't be doing. So it starts actually with our placing broker colleagues having the SCAP clause in the slip. Then for our claims broker colleagues going, right, okay, is the SCAP clause in the slip? Tick. Is the claim within the SCAP criteria? So it is below 250,000 sterling net, so net of deductibles and excesses, that sort of, to all of the insurers that have signed up to be bound by SCAP. If the answer is yes, you then have to say, right, okay, in which market is my intellectual leader? So again, let's say that Swiss Re are our intellectual leader. They're in the Lerma market. But remember, we've got 3 versions of ECF that don't talk to each other. Those walls are impenetrable, pretty much. And so what the broker's still got to do, even if the intellectual leader is in the Lerma market, if there's ILU security and there's Lloyd security, they've still got to put it into those 3 rooms in the class house. But the key thing is they need to label that claim so it is clear and apparent to everybody where the intellectual leader is. Okay. And so that's going to be those SCAP codes that we've got there on the screen. So if it is Swiss Re as a Lerma intellectual slip leader, then the code is SCAP L. If it is, for example, I think we had Aspen as an example of an ILU company, it's that. And then if it's Lloyd's, it's S for syndicate. Okay. Now, if the intellectual slip leader is outside the bureaus, and this would include Lloyd's Insurance Company, is SCAP NB. So what you need to do as insurers is you need to know what hat you're wearing. Are you, in our example, the Swiss Re, where you are both the leader of your bureau, the Lerma leader, but also the intellectual decision maker. If you're the intellectual decision maker, make an intellectual decision. If you're sitting there, for example, as the leader of the Lloyd's market, it's sitting there in your to-do list because of the limitations of the technology. And so therefore what you need to do is look at it and go, oh, it's coded SCAP L or SCAP I or SCAP NB. That's not me. Leave it alone. And as soon as, in my little example, the real leader at the Swiss Re deals with it, a combination of robots and humans at Valonetic should deal with it in the background. Okay. If you're sitting there and it's still in your to-do list and you think, I've done what Charlotte told me to do, I've left it alone, but it's still there, go and have a look in the background in ECF just to see whether the wheels have fallen off the bus. And classic wheel falling off the bus that I've seen, and it's happening more and more recently, is you've got a claim, and I was looking at it for an ILU carrier, and it said SCAP S. So that says, right, intellectual decision makers in the Lloyd's market. Wasn't moving. What the hell's going on? We go and look in the background in ECF. There was no transaction for the Lloyd's market. So the wheels are falling off the bus and rolling down the outside carriageway. Okay. And then last thing, of course, if you are the intellectual decision maker, remember it's in your gift to decide whether that claim is going to be handled under the SCAP rules or not. Okay. So that's all I wanted to pontificate about. Joe, how are we doing on any questions?
We have had one that's come in. So if you've accidentally released a transaction without comments, is there a way to go back into it? So that was from somebody in an IOU market using both ECF1 and ECF2.
I think yes, as long as nobody else that might be touching it has touched it. And so if the transaction is only going to ever come to you, for example, as the ILU leader, and nobody else will need to see it, and so you're seeing it will effectively close the loop and it will be a completed transaction, then potentially not. But again, that's another good example of where the business rules say that one's response to a transaction should always be the radio buttons plus public comments. There is always the potential that the technology will not be locked down in such a way to throw a wobbly at you if you haven't put some public comments in there.
I don't think we've had any other ones in at the moment. So if anyone does have anything, please put it in. I have to say your presentation, as always, Charlotte, was very, very good and answered a lot of the questions that I had as they were coming up. So I've got a few coming in now. So
They got brave now.
Yeah.
I'll stop sharing.
Well, now is the time for people to put them in. So dealing with work queue and baskets, sometimes there are erroneous transactions which cannot be actioned. How do you get these deleted? They did note they're very few and far between.
Okay, so with the erroneous transactions, obviously what we've got to work out is what is erroneous about them. If for some reason they're in your work basket and they appear to be somehow locked down, then probably a way to deal with it, or the easiest way, is to actually contact the broker and ask them to re-release the transaction. That might kind of do enough to refresh it, to allow it to be available to you. If that's not working, and particularly if you're using something like a write back system, then it might be worth checking with your write back provider whether there's some sort of gremlin going on internally.
Thank you. If a reinsurer mistakenly cancels the sequence, will they not have the option to amend their response?
So I'm not sure I understand exactly what this questioner means by cancel a sequence. So if we move on to another question, maybe that questioner can just expand a little bit more about what they mean by that.
Yeah, please just put kind of follow up in the Q&A box, and we'll come back to that one. For the Lerma Circulate screen, can we clarify the minor precautionary screen? If it's said as yes and nil incurred, then it changes then it changes follower responses to agreed. Is that correct?
Right. So the way the minor precautionary works is that as long as it's nil incurred, it will set the followers to a positive response. But the minute the incurred goes above nil, that should dislocate the effect of the minor precautionary button. That's the theory, anyway.
Somebody asked how we'll be able to access the recording, so that will be circulated to everyone
that
after the session. So don't worry about that. We've had quite a few claims recently where the broker on record has changed and the new broker does not have access to the UMR. Is that for the insurer to resolve or the broker?
Right.
That's a good
No,
question.
it's certainly not for the insurer to resolve. Now, and of course, it all depends on the nature of the change of broker. So if you've got a piece of business that's moved from, I don't know, Aon to McGill's, and the entire contract has moved with responsibility for all historic claims and stuff like that, then it's going to be a cleaner situation where the new broker will be allowed to put in what's known as a midterm broker change request to Valenetic to be able to get access to other people's data. But where it can become troublesome is obviously where there is historic data held under that UMR by the old broker, that for perfectly sensible reasons they don't want the new broker to have visibility of. So in that situation, I think it's a case of the broker just trying to get to the heart of what is blocking the old broker, allowing them to have full access to the UMR, and then seeing what resolution is possible. The ultimate unfortunate it's probably more troublesome on the Lloyd side, because on the company side, I suppose the kind of worst case scenario will be that you can effectively create a new UCR where there's no signings in it. I think this would probably work on the company side. No signings in it. The broker will have to manually upload all the security. And then the only downside, of course, is just for everybody's visibility, realizing that, okay, this UCR has been closed off and is being replaced by this one, just in terms of seeing the joined upness of the data. But no, in the first instance, it's the broker's responsibility to try and get a midterm broker change done through Valenetic to get access to the UMR. But I absolutely get that in some situations that permission might not be given by the expiring broker, as it were.
So moving on, what is the purpose for ECF2 automatically ticking a second ILU market when responding to an ECF transaction as ILU bureau lead? This person said they currently untick the second ILU market, as under the IUA claims agreement practices, only the ILU bureau lead is required to comment. Yeah,
so I suppose the baseline is that the technology is trying to be helpful and failing miserably. Particularly if it's an advice, absolutely, that is pretty universally under the agreement practices, single leader. And the idea is that even for settlements, the baseline is single leader, but then they have the option to bring in a second if they want. And I suspect, as I said there, it's the technology that's been set up in the background to try and be helpful, at least for settlements. But I think the key there, unfortunately, and I'm not sure you'll get, at this point in ECF's life, any change requests through to make that technology change, because it's not something that the broker's doing in the background. It's something that's been set up in the background with ECF. You just got to be mindful of saying, right, I must remember to untick, and that anonymous questionnaire is probably screaming at the screen going, it's really boring to have to do that, but that's the reality.
Yeah, no, I agree. So for Lerma, the leader has to
Mm.
check quality of data, and broker is unable to amend data. What happens if the leader makes a mistake?
So very simply, if the leader makes a mistake, and the classic mistake would be missing something. So, for example, didn't notice that the date of loss was wrong, and they circulated that data, then I suppose the ultimate penalty is you end up with a replacement transaction to have to deal with in your to-do list. That's really, that's effectively the more work for you is effectively the penalty.
Someone's asked if you can explain to brokers how to enter the LAE/fees so they are not part of the indemnity limit.
I feel the pain of this caller. Right, so this is only relevant on the Lerma side. So in Lerma, what the brokers can do is they can issue or they can enter in a particular currency, 100% outstanding, and then a separate field, which is of which this amount is fees. So let's say the indemnity was 80,000, the fees was 20,000. The broker would enter 100% in the field. So they'd enter the 100,000 in the top field and then put the 20,000 in the, of which this outstanding is fees. And why don't brokers do that? I don't know why they don't do that. Maybe they just don't realize that it can be done. For batch brokers, it may be that just the way their systems are set up to interface with class, they're not set up to automatically fill in those fields. Maybe, and this is no disrespect to brokers, I'm married to one. It may be just, you're not obliged to do it. This is what I mean about very few fields that are mandatory, but it is super helpful to carriers if it can be done. Unfortunately, there's no such helpful split possible on the ILU side. The only potential is if you've got indemnity in one currency and fees in another currency. You can have multiple currency strands, of course.
Someone has asked whether you can explain the slip order field and what effect an incorrect figure can have.
Oh, they're coming in thick and fast here. Okay. It can have a massive effect. And the reason for that is that when the broker's putting numbers in, they should be putting it in at order level. And it's not just the order that's relevant, it's actually the basis of the signed lines as well. So if insurers' signed lines are of 100%, then it's not quite so troublesome as if the insurer's signed lines are actually of the order. But therefore, what it can mean in practice is that, let's say, and it's quite prevalent with off slips, particularly where the broker might have a little off slip, say a 5% order, and an insurer has written a 100% line, of that order. So 100% of 5%. Sometimes when the risks get signed through Velenetic, they flip it and they make it 100% order and 5% line. Now, at that point, arguably they're the same thing. And problems will probably arise at the point of putting in premium as well. But at the point of a claim, if the broker's saying, right, okay, according to my documentation, it's a 5% order, the 100% reserve is £100. I need to put in my reserve then at order. So the 100% reserve to order is £5. Just a quick math in my head there. £5. Then by the time it gets presented to the insurers, because when the brokers put the signing numbers and dates into the class database, if there are signings, then the signing information about the carriers and their percentage lines is pulled out of the risk databases. Then if Velenetic has signed it so the insurers have a 5% line of the order, instead of the insurers having a reserve to their line of that full £5, they're going to have a reserve of something like 25p, which is going to be completely bonkers. So really, really important. So if the questioner is a claims broker, just always double check actually whether there are any gremlins with the signing, and also remember to put those reserves in at order level. But if you're an insurer, you're looking at those numbers and they look bonkers, just check that first.
Brilliant. Next question. I've got one simpler question and one quite long question, I think,
Yeah.
out of the two left. So, what is the suggested handling of the second response screen if you're a Lerma singleton with no follow market?
You should be able to just leave it alone, I would think. But happy to take that one offline, actually. But yeah, hopefully, as I said, if you are a Lerma singleton, then all you should need to do is you're still going to have to circulate and then respond, and that should be enough. Right, I
Yeah,
can't get a bunch of right, so it's a broker. Okay,
yeah. This one's slightly longer. So
no,
it's
that's fine.
talking about placement being a what is described as a nightmare mix of open market and line slip insurers, all with their own multiple
Right.
signings per insurer. And we
Oh,
do
right.
we do in committees have this type of issue come
Yeah.
up where people ask this question.
So, so, um, sometimes it can be solved, and sometimes it's a sorry, boys and girls, you're going to have to do the claim on ECF on email. So, what you might have, and we'll just keep it within a single market, is that you have a number of different insurers, all who ostensibly come from the same market, where they have offered the client different commercial terms. So it might be different price, different brokerage, yada, yada, yada. Now, of course, those matters are commercially confidential. And so what you will end up with when the risk gets signed through Valenetic is that it's a single risk, single UMR, but there'll be a string of premium signings, each which will have, for example, one insurer linked to it. Okay. And so, and I'll come back to the point this question is making about the open market and line slip as well. The solution that is in the business rules is the creation of what's called a claims FTO. So basically, it is an artificial premium signing. And what it's doing is it is pulling together all the security and under an artificial premium signing. But the important thing is that the documentation that sits in the background in the IMR against that signing is redacted. So none of the commercial confidential stuff is in there. But as claims people, we don't need that to handle the claims. If we want to know whether we've had the premium, we look at our own systems. But in terms of the terms and conditions of the actual insurance or reinsurance, that can be in that redacted slip. Now, in this questioner's particular example, where you've got a mixture of open market and line slip, that solution isn't typically going to work, because what you might have is a mixture of years of account, because you might have a declaration to a line slip that is running from mid 24 to mid 25, where you're then got the line slip year of account is 24, whereas for the actual declaration that's being made to that line slip is 25. So if you've got that right old hodgepodge of security, ECF, I don't think in any of its forms is going to work. That's going to be email all the way, I'm afraid, which is painful, but that's true. And the last question, the most thorny question of all, well, I think the latest thing that I've seen come out is talking about testing going to be underway from late next year.
Yeah, so this is for Blueprint 2. For those who can't see the question, and I don't think from an IUA perspective we've got anything to add to the timeframes that have been put out publicly. And as Charlotte was saying, the testing is underway at the moment, and that will take as long as it takes, because it's being done to a high standard. So I think that's the message that we've got at the moment. Albeit, I appreciate a lot of the nuances that we talk about here. Part of the solution will be the new claims portal in Blueprint 2. So I understand why people are always asking that question. I think we've had one more in as well.
Yeah.
So
So,
as a following member in Lerma, INF response is made in the second response screen. How to give INF in the first response screen as the leader of the bureau without circulating?
you can't, as far as I'm aware, you can't. And that's one of those really kind of bonkers bits of functionality where the transaction has to be circulated before there can be any intellectual response. Now, I know that some write back systems Docker, at least, I think, has it set up so if you're the leader, you can circulate and intellectually respond in the right back system effectively on the same screen, but it's still two different activities. She's probably not the answer that that person wanted.
All right, well, I think we've got through all of the questions there. So thank you everyone for putting those in. There were some great ones in there, and I think really made the most of this session. A massive thank you to you, Charlotte, for once again going into
Pleasure.
all of the details, all of the questions that I think we see a lot in the market. So it's really useful to have these sessions. Obviously, we do have a SCAP session coming up later in the year as well, and we will be running another ECF session in the future. So we want to get these regular sessions out there for the whole market to benefit. If you have any further questions or comments, I think we're happy to take those via email, including the one I think we're going to follow up on. So I think, yeah, whoever asked that question earlier, if you've got any kind of clarifications to that, please do send them on to us.
Yeah, that was a question about the cancelled transaction. Yeah.
We will be circulating the slides and recording from this session as well. So look out for those. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you again, Charlotte, for a brilliant session.
No, absolute pleasure. Take care, everybody. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you.